Okay, now a very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us now. Catherine, I'm just talking to you. I hope you can see me waving at you. I think there's some internet issue. Okay, wait a minute then. हाँ जी. हाँ बेटा, मैं क्लास लेने लगी हूँ, आ जाओ तुम बस अब. ठीक है. Finally, we can hear you, Catherine. There's a big smile on your face. Thank you. Thank you very much for sorting it out. Thanks a lot. No, unmute yourself. Unmute.
Hey, how about now?
Oh, yes. Haha.
Okay, weird. I can't press the unmute button on my screen. I need to press it somewhere, but no worries.
It's okay, it's okay. As long as we can hear each other, we can see each other, it's good.
Thank you.
So, okay, I think without much delay further, let me just introduce today's expert speaker to the audience. Catherine is specializing in international relations and global health. She was awarded a PhD in security studies by the University of Hong Kong. At UCM, she has been teaching and researching topics including Chinese foreign policy, EU China relations, global health governance, and Chinese health diplomacy. She is the author of HIV/AIDS in China and India, Governing Health Security. Her book won the Global Health Section a prize for the Best Book Award from the International Studies Association in 2017. In February 2012, she published a co-edited volume with Amsterdam University Press about COVID-19 responses and the role of WHO in Asia. So, welcome, Catherine. And she would be speaking on EU involvement in global health, COVID-19, and vaccine distribution. So, that would be the topic for today's session. So, it's over to you, Catherine. I hope you can start sharing your screen. There is a icon in the middle which is square and
Yeah.
with an arrow. Yeah, just click on that.
Uh, it said I can't share my screen.
You can't share your screen. Why?
Yeah, because it said the system does not allow me to do so.
Yours is, you have been made a co-host in this, so I think you should be able to share.
But I think when I about to this to leave the left the meeting, then the system said I am no longer a co-host. I'm not sure whether it's still the case.
You are the host of the meeting, so I think you
Okay.
should. So, what you do is, first, have you opened
Hmm.
your presentation and minimized it?
Yeah, let me try.
So Menakshi, maybe
Yes.
what we can do is if she send the PowerPoint to
In the
me,
mail, right?
Yeah,
I
Okay.
can
that's
actually play it.
All
If
right.
it doesn't, yeah, what do you
Yes,
think?
we can try that. Yes.
okay. Let me send it to you right now.
Perfect.
Sorry for all this
No
technical
No
problem.
glitch.
problem.
Yeah.
Technology has its own ways. Don't worry about it. It happens with each one of us.
Thank you. Uh, entire screen. Yeah. Stefano, I sent you my PowerPoint slide.
Just a second.
Can you receive it?
Not yet. Just a second.
Yeah, it takes time because the PowerPoint
Yeah.
slide is, I mean, the size is quite big, the file size.
Okay, I think it's in here. Let me see.
Yeah.
Okay, give me 1 minute and they're gonna be there.
Thanks.
Okay, almost there. Okay,
Yes.
Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you.
perfect. Welcome.
So, Catherine, you may start the presentation, and Stefano will keep changing the slides once you mention.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction and also for your kind patience with these technical problems on my side. Good evening, everyone. My name is Catherine Lo. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, assistant professor at University College Maastricht. I'm a political scientist by training, but I've conducted interdisciplinary research across international relations and global health. So this is the cover of my book. As mentioned before, last year I published a co-edited book on public health in Asia during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an open access book, so you can download it for free, which is a good news. Anyway, how do we go about today's lecture? We will start off with an overview of the global COVID-19 pandemic. Next, we will zoom into the EU responses to COVID-19, in particular its vaccine strategy, as the title of this presentation indicate. Then we will look into the role of the EU in global health during the COVID-19 pandemic. To conclude the lecture, I will discuss the challenges of the EU leadership in global health. Next slide, please. So let me briefly remind you what happened almost 3 years ago. The first COVID-19 cases were reported in Wuhan in Hubei province in China on the 1st of December 2019. Around mid-January 2020, WHO reported a case in Thailand in a Chinese woman who had arrived from Wuhan. It was the first reported case outside of China. On the 4th of February, the Japanese Health Ministry announced that 10 people aboard the Diamond Prince cruise ship docked in Yokohama Bay were confirmed to have COVID. In mid-February, from China to Asia, the virus reached other parts of the world. On the Valentine's Day, a Chinese tourist who tested positive for COVID passed away in France, becoming the first person to be killed by COVID in Europe. On the same day, Egypt reported to WHO its first case of COVID. The confirmed case was the first in Africa since the virus was detected. COVID-19 eventually was declared as a pandemic by WHO on the 11th of March 2020. The declaration indicates the severity of the disease. On the 19th of March 2020, China, for the first time, reported no domestic cases of COVID-19 since the outbreak began. Later on, the total confirmed cases in the US surpassed the number of cases in China on the 26th of March. Since late March 2020, US has become the country having the largest infection number, followed by India and France. And fast forward today, we can move on to the next slide. So fast forward to today, the total reported COVID-19 cases were more than 684 million, while the death toll from the virus reaches over 6 million across almost 200 countries. And in Europe, around 33% of the global infection cases were reported in this region by April 2023. I just checked the number before I joined the meeting. For the next slide, before the launch of COVID-19 vaccines, non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, were the main measures implemented in countries in the world. NPIs are actions, apart from getting vaccinated and taking medicine, that people and communities can take to slow down the spread of diseases like COVID-19. Examples of NPIs are social distancing and ban on mass gathering and public events. NPIs are believed to be the best way to control novel infectious diseases because NPIs could buy time for scientists to develop COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. And for normal circumstances, vaccine development is a lengthy process. For vaccines have to go through a 3-stage clinical trials before they are sent to regulatory agencies for approval. The whole process could take around 10 to 15 years. But in the case of the COVID-19 vaccine, in less than a year, more than 150 vaccines were in development worldwide. As of November 2020, 11 COVID-19 vaccine candidates have entered the final phase of clinical trial before the regulatory approval. The first COVID-19 vaccine in the world was rolled out on the 8th of December in 2020 in an old woman in the UK. And by April 2023, almost 70% of the world population has received at least one dose. However, only 28.5% people in low-income countries have received at least one dose. So how about in EU? In the EU, vaccination against COVID-19 started on the 27th of December in 2020. By the end of August in 2021, the EU reaches the important milestone of 70% of the EU adult population getting fully vaccinated. And as of September 2022, 83.4% of adult population in the EU is fully vaccinated. Regarding the EU vaccine strategy, like other developed countries, EU ensured sufficient vaccine supplies for EU member states through advance purchase agreements with vaccine producers. However, EU member states, they did not negotiate with this company individually. The European Commission, which is the executive arm of the EU, has been in charge of negotiating contracts with the pharmaceutical firms on behalf of the 27 member states. But that's sad because every country was so panicked with COVID at that time. So instead of waiting for the European Commission to negotiate for the pharmaceutical companies, some EU member states, they also have separate deals with the companies. For example, Germany secured 30 million additional vaccine doses for its own citizens under a separate agreement with BioNTech. The German deal was sealed 2 months even before the EU Commission finalized the EU-wide contracts with Pfizer and BioNTech. And as I said, because the the European Commission should be the one to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies on behalf of all member states. So what Germany was doing could be seen as a breach of the EU agreements, which prohibited member states from negotiating separate deals. But at that time, the European Commission has refused to comment on whether Germany has violated EU agreements. But what Germany was doing could jeopardize the solidarity between European countries. Next slide, please. So the EU coordinates approval for vaccines through the independent scientific advice of the European Medicines Agency, EMA. So far, the European Commission has granted a conditional marketing authorization for 8 COVID-19 vaccines. And from the PowerPoint slide, you can see these 8 candidates. The last one, Chitkara, is the first bivalent recombinant protein vaccine against COVID-19 to be authorized in the Europe. And Chitkara is indicated as a booster for people over 16 years of age in Europe. So apparently, EU member states were among the first countries in the world to receive COVID-19 vaccination. However, the EU has had a bumpy COVID-19 vaccine rollout. EU member states complained about the European Commission being too slow to approve the vaccines compared to their UK counterparts. In addition, the EU could not receive the amount of vaccines from the vaccine producers that the EU had secured by the advance purchase agreements. In January 2021, supplies of vaccine produced by Pfizer BioNTech were dropped due to production issues. Meanwhile, another major vaccine supplier, AstraZeneca, informed the EU in January 2021 that the company will be able to supply only 100 million instead of 300 million doses in the first half of the year due to production problems and export control. As a result, some member states decided to work outside the EU vaccine strategy to secure vaccine for its own populations elsewhere. So I just told you about the case of Germany, and also Cyprus asked Israel for COVID-19 vaccines, while at the same time, Hungary secured 2 million doses of Russian Sputnik vaccine. Next slide, please. And the vaccine rollout in the EU suffered another serious backlash when several studies released in February 2021 that people receiving AstraZeneca had developed a rare type of blood clots that block veins and arteries. More than a dozen EU member states, such as Austria, Denmark, and Italy, paused their rollout of AstraZeneca jab. Although many countries were later on taking the AstraZeneca jab again after the European Medicines Agency confirmed that the AstraZeneca vaccine was safe, European citizens have lost the trust on AstraZeneca vaccines. So the blood clot indicates associated with AstraZeneca vaccines, as well as the company's failure to meet delivery agreements have led the European Commission to prioritize BioNTech over AstraZeneca. In May 2021, the European Commission signed the world's largest vaccine deal with BioNTech and Pfizer. The contract reserves an additional 1.8 billion doses on behalf of all EU member states between 2021 and 2023. So this deal has made the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines the main vaccine being used in European vaccination campaign. Next, please. Okay, so in the following part, I would like to highlight two roles of the EU in global health during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the two roles are EU is the exporter of COVID-19 vaccine and also a defender of global health governance. So let's talk about the first role of EU as an exporter of COVID-19 vaccines. So as I mentioned, because the EU could secure its vaccines for their own population, and EU also have a mandate to help the world to counter COVID-19 pandemic by being a global leader in vaccine exports. Unlike the UK and the US, which in the earlier phases of the vaccine rollout focused on domestic vaccinations, the EU continued to export half the vaccine is produced. Although EU did it quietly to avoid a public nationalist backlash at home. So the idea is if at that time, if the EU just send out all the vaccine to other parts of the world, then people within the EU will start questioning why the government not helping its own population instead of helping others. So EU did it quite quietly. It's a good and also a bad thing, but I will talk about it later on. So anyway, in 2021 alone, the EU exported 1.4 billion COVID-19 vaccines doses to over 150 countries. Although the biggest vaccine recipients have been those wealthier countries such as the UK, Japan, and Turkey that have contracts with vaccine producers based in the EU. The EU also distribute COVID-19 vaccines to less developed countries via three key mechanisms. So which are the EU Civic Protection Mechanism, the COVAX, and also Team Europe Initiative. And I'm going to talk about all these three mechanisms one by one. Next slide, please. So the first mechanism is the EU Civic Protection Mechanism. It was established by the European Commission in October 2001. So even before the pandemic, even before the SARS outbreak. The mechanism aims to strengthen cooperation between the EU countries and 6 participating countries on civic protection to improve prevention, preparedness, and respond to disasters, including pandemic. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU Civic Protection Mechanism has coordinated and co-financed the delivery of over 23 million items of personal protective and medical equipment to over 30 countries to support their COVID-19 response. 22 million vaccine doses have been delivered to 40 countries by the mechanism. So this is the first mechanism. And the second mechanism I think is quite well known, which is the COVAX, COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access. The next slide, yeah. So the second mechanism is quite well known, is COVAX. COVAX is a global initiative aimed at equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines for 92 low and middle income governments through donations. COVAX is the vaccine pillar to COVID-19 tools accelerator, ACT. And the ACT accelerator is a global collaboration to accelerate development, production, and access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. The ACT accelerator was launched by the Director General of the WHO and co-hosted by the President of France, the President of the European Commission, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations in April 2020. So in fact, the EU, especially the European Commission, play a very key leadership role in the COVAX initiative. So through the COVAX in February 2021, Ghana became the first country to receive COVID-19 vaccine doses, and by mid-January 2022, over 1 billion doses have been delivered to 144 countries. And out of the 408 million doses EU member states have donated to countries around the world, around 352 doses have been shared by COVAX. And in addition, EU member states have delivered 56 million doses through bilateral donations, for instance, to its neighbor states in the Western Balkans. So this is the second mechanism. And the third one is on the next slide. Yes. So as I said, European leaders have also tried other approaches to show their commitment to reduce global inequalities in access to vaccines. So apart from the first and second mechanism, the EU and its member states have highlighted the efforts to make sure other countries can also manufacture their own vaccine, particularly in Africa. So at the 320 meeting in May 2021, the Commission announced the third mechanism, which is called Team Europe Initiative, on manufacturing and access to vaccines, medicines, and health technologies in Africa. Team Europe consists of the EU, the European member states, the European Investment Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. According to the EU, a central part of that effort will focus on the establishment of hubs for manufacturing mRNA vaccines. So with the support from the initiative, BioNTech announced agreements to establish manufacturing sites in Rwanda and Senegal that would involve end-to-end production of mRNA vaccines. BioNTech said that it would eventually transfer its manufacturing capacity and know-how to its local partners. The construction of the Rwanda site will begin it's already begun in mid-2022. And once the facility complete, the facility will have the capacity to produce 50 million doses per year. So the next slide. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are three key mechanisms that EU has been playing as the exporter of COVID-19 vaccine, which also demonstrate EU leadership in global health. But in fact, the EU leadership is not without criticism. In the early stage of the pandemic in Europe, the EU has surprised the international community by setting up border controls and export bans on medical equipment. I think all of you have heard about the term vaccine nationalism. And this term is primarily direct to the EU. So vaccine nationalism is a strategy to hold vaccines from manufacturers and increase supply in their own country. And the EU was also the main force that blocked a proposal by South Africa and India in the World Trade Organization, WTO, to suspend patents for a limited amount of time to scale up production. So the EU actually, and also the UK and Switzerland have been the most outspoken critics of the patent waiver initiative. They argue that waiving the intellectual property rights in the short term would not help contain the pandemic, while European leaders said they are open to discussing the issue. There are many opponents in countries such as Germany insisted that the protection of intellectual property is a source of innovation, and it must remain so in the future. Even the current German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he did not agree with the planned intellectual property waiver for COVID-19 vaccines, and because he also believed that patents are an important way of encouraging companies to continue pushing ahead with new research. And how about another key leader in the EU, France? What is the position of France? For France, France initially indicated support of a IP waiver. For example, President Macron told the European Parliament in 2022 that it has been relatively easy for France to take the position because France had not developed a vaccine that was protected by a patent. So for the French president, the IP waiver is not a big problem, but for Germany, it is a big debate in the country. So, but at the end, in June 2022, during the WTO ministerial conference, the WTO members finally reaches the agreement of partial patent waiver for COVID-19 vaccines. Although the agreement fell short of a demand by India and South Africa to exempt all COVID-related vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. Instead, governments can issue a compulsory license to domestic manufacturers, but must compensate the patent holders. Okay, next slide, please. So I just mentioned the first role of the EU in global health during the COVID-19 crisis. And apart from vaccine manufacturing and distribution, the EU has been the main supporter of the proposal of a new pandemic treaty under the WHO. So before the pandemic treaty proposal, there is only one legal binding agreement for addressing global spread of infectious diseases, which is the International Health Regulations, IHR. IHR is issued under the WHO Constitution and adopted by its member states. The first version, which was called International Sanitary Regulations, was agreed in 1951. And since then, there have been a number of revisions. The revision we were using before the SARS outbreak was agreed in 1981. And the current version was agreed in 2005 and entered into effect in 2007. Therefore, we usually refer to the current version as IHR 2005. The current version has a much broader scope of application than that of early versions, since the early versions only require member states to report to only 3 disease outbreaks to WHO, which are cholera, plague, and yellow fever. After SARS, the IHR was revised to cover all events potentially constituting a public health emergency of international concern. So COVID, of course, fall into that category of potentially constituting a public health emergency of international concern. And that's why China, because China was the first country reported the COVID-19 outbreak, so China has the obligation to report to WHO within 24 hours. But in fact, based on multiple studies, it shows that China was delayed its report to WHO by 1 month. But we can talk about it later. Okay, so but the international legal binding agreement for addressing global spread of infectious diseases has shown to be ineffective. Even we can say it's failed to prevent COVID-19 becoming a global pandemic. So in other words, IHR is not working quite well in this pandemic. We have seen IHR could not make some countries to share information of infectious disease outbreaks. And the IHR could not coordinate the implementation of travel and trade restrictions, despite the WHO not recommending them. And IHR failed to make countries to follow other temporary recommendations issued by WHO IHR Emergency Committee. So furthermore, IHR obligations are heavily designed towards prevention and detection of pathogens, and very limited on response stages to prevent transmission. So we have seen a huge gap in the IHR that need to be revised. Thus came to the idea of a new pandemic treaty. So the idea of a new pandemic treaty was first proposed by European Council President in November 2020. So again, EU play a role in proposing a new treaty to regulate disease outbreak control across the world. So after the European Council President proposed the treaty, the WHO Director General and also a collection of countries in the Global South agree upon the treaty, the proposal of the treaty. And according to EU officials, the treaty would need to have a legally binding element to provide a clear basis for the kind of collective action to prepare for and fight pandemics. So again, the new pandemic treaty would be a legal binding treaty. So actually the treaty has been negotiated among countries. And according to the process agreed by the government at a special session of the World Health Assembly in late 2021, the draft will be finalized and then to be considered by member states in 2024 during the 77th World Health Assembly. So in parallel with making a new pandemic treaty, governments are also discussing more than 300 amendments to the current international health regulations. And as I said, because the IHR focus more on prevention and detection of pathogens instead of responses to the pandemic. So countries not try to dump the IHR, but they try again to amend the IHR after COVID-19 outbreak. Next slide, please. And for the new treaty, and even for the current IHR, WHO is the only leader at the UN level to implement these treaties. And as the sole global health organization, WHO has received both praises and criticism in managing global health. One frequent critic is about the WHO delaying the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, FIC. So the designation of an outbreak grants the WHO Director General additional powers to issue recommendations for how countries should respond. While countries can ignore those directives, such an announcement can increase global attention to an outbreak. And the FIC declaration is made when the disease outbreak poses a risk to more than one country and requires a coordinated international response. However, the declaration of FIC has been criticized. For example, during the H1N1 outbreak, maybe the next slide. Yeah, so the declaration of FIC has been criticized. So for example, during the H1N1 outbreak, WHO stated that as many as 2 billion people could be infected over the next 2 years, which is nearly 1/3 of the world population. After WHO declared FIC on H1N1 in 2009, millions of doses of swine flu vaccine had been ordered by national governments from big pharmaceutical companies. But millions of vaccine doses were eventually destroyed because the 2 billion people infection scenario did not happen. So people criticize WHO is giving favor to the pharmaceutical company by declaring the FIC so that the farm company could make a huge profit from national governments. And in the case of Ebola, in 2014, a leaked document shows that WHO was intentionally delayed declaring a FIC. Critics argue that WHO saw the Ebola outbreak as a health emergency to Africa only, but not to the world, in particular to the West. And there are some studies also shows that it takes 138 days for WHO to declare Ebola as a FIC, while it only took 38 days for WHO to declare H1N1 as a FIC. So when people comparing Ebola and H1N1 FIC declarations, people make such criticism to WHO. How about the case of COVID-19 pandemic? In the case of COVID-19, WHO did not declare the outbreak to be a FIC until the end of January 2020. On January 2020, on the 23rd of January 2020, the same day that the Chinese government announced a full lockdown in Wuhan and 2 other cities, the WHO convened an emergency committee. The committee asserted that the coronavirus did not yet constitute a fake, and that the extent of human-to-human transmission was still unclear. While WHO emergency committee makes such claim, in reality, we could also see reports showing that COVID-19 has been spread across Asia, including Thailand, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Vietnam. And it was only when the virus had spread to all provinces and major cities in China on the 30th of January that the WHO declared the outbreak constitute a fake. So again, this is another criticism during the COVID-19 outbreak, that the WHO intentionally delay the declaration, and some commentators speculate that WHO avoid declaring a fake right after the Wuhan lockdown, because WHO was concerned it would have been perceived by the Chinese authorities as distrust of their capacity to control the disease within China. WHO officers were also aware that angering China could result in Chinese officials sharing less information with the international community, or stopping WHO experts from investigating the origins of the virus. Despite the fact that the WHO praised China in public a lot, it has been reported by the media that the WHO officials privately complained about China, that the Chinese authorities were not sharing enough data to allow them to assess how effectively the virus spread between people, or what risk it posed to the rest of the world. Furthermore, there have been accusations that WHO is being influenced by China. One Japanese minister, for example, said that the WHO should be renamed as Chinese Health Organization, WHO. Meanwhile, Facebook users renamed the WHO as the Winnie the Pooh Health Organization. And Winnie the Pooh referred to President Xi Jinping. Critics have also accused the Director General of the WHO of serving Chinese interests in responding to COVID-19 because of his personal connections with China, or China connections of the Ethiopian government. I think all of you know the current Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. He was Ethiopia's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2016. During his tenure, there was an electrified Ethiopian-Djibouti railway line was built by China Railway Group and China Civil Engineering Construction, with the Chinese Export-Import Bank financing 70% of the construction cost. The line connects to Djibouti, which houses the first and the only Chinese military base overseas. So people see such connection between Ethiopia and China, and between Dr. Tedros and Chinese or China. Another connection between China and Ethiopia can also be seen in the fact that the former Director General of the WHO, you can see from the picture, Margaret Chan, she is a Hong Kong Chinese official before she was before she became the Director General of WHO. So Margaret Chan supported Tedros in the selection process when Margaret Chan need to step down. So although these facts do not necessarily mean that the WHO has fallen prey to Chinese influence, they create suspicions at a time when public trust in the organization is flattering. So, and because of all this criticism and the US during the Trump administration threatened the WHO to quit WHO if WHO remain such attitudes towards the Chinese government. And US really left, and of course they sort of rejoined during the Biden administration. So next slide, please. So how about the EU? What EU has been doing? With all this criticism and also sort of like threatened by the US government, and also other criticism saying that WHO should no longer exist, which is a very extreme way of seeing WHO. But instead of walking away from the WHO, like the US did during the Trump administration, Europe has focused on efforts to strengthen the collective multilateral system of global health. In other words, EU tried to help WHO to be a stronger global health organization. So how the EU could help in strengthening the WHO capacity and also the independence. The German health official proposed that WHO should increase the assessed contribution of member states. I think most of you will know that for WHO, there are two types of, mainly there are two types of budget that the WHO could receive from member states and other organizations, which are assessed contribution. I call it a membership fee, and also voluntary contribution. So the German health officer advocate for an increase in the level of assessed contribution. So in other words, hey, each member state, if you pay more to WHO, then the WHO could do more and could do better. I'm not sure whether you know that like the size of WHO budget they receive, WHO receive, the size of the budget WHO receive is the same amount as a Geneva hospital or a US hospital. So how could a global health institution regulate global health with a budget similar to a hospital in Geneva or the US? And that's why EU proposed the idea of just raising the membership fee, then the problem can be solved. And the US also have the same idea of raising funding for the WHO so that the WHO could be kind of more capable to respond to pandemic outbreak and a bit less influenced by member states, for example, like walking away during the pandemic. So in November 2022, a new pandemic fund was established. The pandemic fund is housed at the World Bank, which also has staff from WHO. It is hoped that the pandemic fund would allow for greater autonomy and support independent governance by shielding WHO from excessive political influence. Okay. So I will conclude the lecture with this slide. So overall, the coronavirus has highlighted that the European Union does not have strong enough tools to deal with an emergency, such as the spread of novel infectious disease. While the EU has significant competency in public health, healthcare systems remain the responsibility of member states, with minimal cooperation at EU level. Therefore, at the EU level, on November 11, 2020, the European Commission is taking the first step towards building the European Health Union, announced by President von der Leyen in her State of the Union address. Underneath the European Health Union, the existing European Centre for Disease Control and the European Medicines Agency have been reinforced and equipped with stronger mandates to address emergency disease outbreaks. And to better prevent, detect, and respond to health emergencies, the European Commission established the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, HERA, in September 2021. So when an emergency hits, HERA would ensure the development, production, and distribution of medicines, vaccines, and other medical countermeasures, such as gloves and masks, that were often lacking during the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is what the European Union has been trying to improve its capacity in responding to infectious disease outbreak after COVID. But still, I would say the EU lacks a positive narrative or an effective communication strategy during COVID-19. As I said, EU has been the main exporter of COVID-19 vaccines, and EU has been a defender of global health governance by supporting the WHO in managing global health affairs. But it seems that not so many people realize, or at least people living in Europe, seems that they don't know what their government has been doing. I mean, the EU at the EU level. So, for example, in the initial stage of the pandemic, Siberian President Vucic, he criticized a lack of supplies of protective equipment from European partners. And then he was keen to say that European solidarity does not exist. And he even highlighted that only China could help Serbia. And from the PowerPoint slide, you could see a billboard set up in the city center of Serbia in Belgrade with the message, "Thank you, Brother Xi," in praising of Chinese President Xi Jinping and China helping Serbia by providing masks and gloves and other medical equipment. But in fact, as I mentioned in earlier slides, EU has continued to support the Western Balkans, including Serbia, in fighting against the coronavirus. But most of these efforts have gone unnoticed by the country's publics. So, how to increase the EU leadership role in global health via technology would be my next 4-year research project funded by the EU Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program. We will look into it with this 4-year project. We will look into how EU could be a leader in multilateral system, including the field of global health. And we will share the result with European Commission as our stakeholder and other European leaders, so that EU could be a global leader in compare with the US and China. I think this is the last thing I want to say. Thank you for your patience and also your time to listen to this presentation. I hope you enjoy it. And if you have questions, feel free to ask. I hope I can answer you.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Thank you for such an elaborate session about involvement of EU in the COVID-19 and the vaccine distribution. You started by explaining, giving us an overview of COVID-19, the sequence of events, went on to explain the current status of vaccination in UK, EU, and the USA. And then you explained the two major roles EU is playing in COVID-19 pandemic. One as an exporter of vaccines and to around 150 countries, and also how it has been a defender of global health governance and its role in strengthening the WHO's capacity also. So all in all, a very good session from your side. And yes, we do have a few questions. So let me begin by asking the first question I have with me is um, Hiraddeep wants to understand there was a graph which you showed about COVID 19 vaccine doses administered per 100 people till April 2nd, right? So,
Yeah.
in that, the number of doses administered per 100 were above 100, like 200 something. So he wants to understand, is that a correct depiction or not? I feel it shows the total number of doses given to 100 people so far. It doesn't tell about a particular time.
Thank you
uh,
for your
I
question.
think if you start with your initial slides,
Yeah.
I'll tell you which slide would that be. Just let me find out. It must be the third or fourth slide.
Yeah. Which slide?
Yeah, I will tell you that. Wait a
Thank you.
minute. I'll have to find out. All right. So I think it is your yeah. Just go in the beginning, maybe the second, third slide after the Stefano. You'll have to help her out. So you had an agenda, then COVID-19 overview, and then the next slide, EU vaccine strategy. You have yellow colored horizontal bar graph.
I think
Yes.
it's slide number 5,
Probably yes.
right?
Yeah, if you
And
could explain that.
the question is,
Should I repeat the
yeah,
question?
I read the question also from the
Okay.
chat
All right.
box.
All right.
Um,
Yeah, this is the slide. Correct.
I think these are not the percentage of vaccination, it's more the number.
Probably what it says is some people would have got more than one dose by then, no? So
Yeah,
so the number of total doses per 100 people. So if 100 people, each one has got two doses so far, so the number would come close to 200, right?
yep. And
So that is
even,
how we can explain this.
yep, and
Hiraz, I
even the,
hope it is clear to you now.
yeah.
Okay, all right. So we move on.
Okay.
Another question is, as 8 candidates of vaccines were authorized by EU, I think candidates, by candidates he means the manufacturing companies, were
Yeah.
authorized by EU. What was the criteria adopted by the individual countries when they were choosing the vaccines for themselves? On what parameters did they, choose one company over another?
As I said, the EU vaccine strategy is like I mean the vaccine candidate are kind of chosen by the European Commission, and how the individual countries choose the vaccines. I think it depends on how much do they get from each company. for example, like the EU have these 8 candidates, maybe one country would get 1,000, the other from Pfizer, and 300 from AstraZeneca. I think this is the. Oh, but you mean the criteria? The criteria depends on the EU recommendation.
Probably there may be some financial negotiations also going on behind, like how many doses, so what will be the cost per unit? Could that be a factor also?
The cost is negotiated at the EU level, so
Yes.
I don't think the
Okay.
cost is the main
Not
concern.
not individual countries.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Um then we have a question. Was the vaccine diplomacy of EU dictated by its geopolitical interests? As I see,
Mhm.
Chile was the only recipient in South America, Mexico in North America, and Singapore in East Asia, and bulk to UK.
Uh, the answer could be yes or no. As I said, uh, like where the EU vaccine goes depends on whether other countries have contract with EU with the pharmaceutical company in the EU. So that could be one reason. Simply just because of the business, just because of business, they have contract, and that's why vaccine has been sent to a particular country. For geopolitical interest, I would say I can't say no entirely, because normally countries always have their interest in sending vaccine. For example, why China sent vaccine to Southeast Asia first, because of course because of the proximity, and also because Southeast Asian countries is important for China in geopolitical uh, terms. So I can't fully answer this question, and I can only say it's not only about geopolitical interest. It's something also to do with the existing business contract.
All right. Okay. He also has added another dimension to it, asking if Hong Kong also received vaccines from People's Republic of China.
Uh, yes. Uh, for Hong Kong, we bought vaccine not we bought vaccine the from the BioNTech in Germany. We also import vaccine from China, especially Sinovac. So this is not donation. We need to pay to the People Republic of China.
Okay. So, Catherine, I have put in a question for you. That is, I want you to draw a comparison between European Union and United States as far as the vaccine distribution and their foreign policy is concerned.
Wow, it's a very broad question. So the comparison, you want me to talk about the strategy, how they distribute vaccine, right?
Yes.
Okay. I would say one difference, as I mentioned in the presentation, is for the US, they mainly concern about domestic administration during when the vaccine start roll out in the world. US kept the vaccine for their own citizen, while the EU, of course, they try to administrate its own citizen. They also try to export vaccine to other countries. So I think this is a very big difference between the EU and US. And for the US, I would say there has been a clearer geopolitical interest for the US in distributing vaccine. For example, US distribute vaccine to Japan and also South Korea and also Taiwan. And Taiwan is a very obvious case of the geopolitical interest of the US because because China, I mean, because BioNTech could not enter Taiwan, and the U.S. donate Moderna to Taiwan so as to help Taiwan to counter the political influence of Taiwan from China.
Okay, thank you. So, do you think EU is doing enough to help Asia and Southeast Asia to cooperate in the field of communicable disease prevention?
Um, you mean, I would say there has
The
been
kind of
existing,
help, the
yeah.
kind of help EU is providing to Asia and other Southeastern Asian countries. In terms of how do we prevent communicable diseases? Is there enough being done from EU side to help these countries?
I would say more can be done. I know there has been EU ASEAN health cooperation, so EU and also with the 10 ASEAN member states. Um, but I would say in terms of vaccine distribution, I don't see a very clear, distinctive help only to Asia or Southeast Asian country. The focus for EU is more on the Western Balkan states and also African countries, I would say.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. So our next question is, what is the acceptance of COVID vaccine amongst different EU state members? For example, you can give us example of some of the ones which gave very good response to vaccination and others who did not accept vaccination very easily. So,
You,
is there any difference between vaccine acceptance in poor as well as rich countries?
within EU member states, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I have some figures on my hand. Um, for example, because in the presentation I talks about the problem of AstraZeneca because of the possible blood clots issue, and there was a poll released in March 2021 showing that in France, 61% of respondents said that AstraZeneca vaccine was unsafe or very unsafe, and more than 50% of Germans believe that AstraZeneca vaccine was unsafe. And for Italy and Spain, the unaccepted rate of AstraZeneca was about 43 and 52 percent respectively in Italy and Spain. I would say because of AstraZeneca blood clot issue, that's make the public in general in Europe lost the trust on other vaccine candidates. Not only AstraZeneca, they also question about other vaccine candidates. And actually, in the initial vaccine rollout in eastern part of Germany, uh, because the eastern part is more have more connection with the Russian because of history, and we have seen some Eastern German people, they travel together to Moscow to get the Russian Sputnik V vaccine. Um, so I would say, yeah, there has been some differences. And for Netherlands, the vaccination acceptance is a bit higher than France and Italy and Spain.
Okay, fine. We come to the final question, which says that did EU send vaccines to the war-struck Yemen and Syria?
Uh, I do not have an answer to this question. I'm sorry, but I can check it.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. That's okay.
Mhm.
So I think with that we end the questions. Or there's one more. What was the reason for sending vaccines to Saudi Arabia, which is a relatively well-off nation? I mean, it's not a poor nation
Ah,
with its resources. So, which was at war with Yemen, which is a poor nation. So, can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
uh, I think is it's because of business, because Saudi Arabia, they are rich enough to purchase vaccine from Europe. So when we say sending, could mean two different things. Could be I buy and then someone buy from from Europe and then they just send it, or the EU send it for free. So we have to distinguish between the different meaning of sending vaccines. And here I would say sending vaccine to Saudi Arabia is deliver vaccine because Saudi Arabia pay to the EU. I mean, sorry, to the European pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you, Catherine. And we sincerely hope with HERA in place, that is Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority in place, we'll be better prepared to handle medical emergencies and pandemics in future. And before I end, I would like to invite Stefano to share his thoughts about today's session and to close the session.
Okay,
Stefano.
thank you. Yeah. So thank you so much, Catherine. It was really excellent, and I guess that all of us now has much more actually knowledge about this actually specific topic, and let's hope that the same things it will not happen after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, even if I don't see nothing in action to make this not happening again. So let's hope that in the upcoming 3, 4, 5 years, instead of having a new virus, we're going to have much more people who are experts in health diplomacy, like you, which are much needed now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano. And thank you for all the questions. And if I couldn't answer some questions, I'm happy to check it up. And if you have further questions, feel free to email me. From the PowerPoint slide, you can see my email address, so feel free to drop me an email.
Okay, thank you. Anybody wants to ask any question or we end the meeting here?
I guess, actually, Meenakshi, you have some actually new question about the actually booster dose.
Yeah, it is there.
Booster dose policy, Catherine. It was some common booster policy for the vaccination, or the member states went in a separate order for the third, fourth, fifth injection.
The booster doses.
Yeah. The booster, as I mentioned, the latest approval of vaccine candidate HERA is a booster for people aged over 16 years old, and this is a EU level policy of the booster. And I would say in the Netherlands, we have the booster, but when the booster roll out, it's only for medical practitioners and also elderly people, and also, for example, pregnant women. And for the so-called general public, you can opt for a booster. But it seems the booster take-out rate in the Netherlands is not high enough as they predicted. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that is sufficient. So I think with that we can end the meeting today. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you once again for coming and sparing time and explaining in details the involvement of EU in COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, and we are going to end the meeting. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thanks very much. Bye
Thank you
bye.
very much.
Bye
Bye
Thank
bye.
bye.
you. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.